Good morning, good day, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. I am Cecilia Malmström. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics. Today, I am honored to have two exceptional guests with me. Dr. Jennifer Hillman, who is a senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, a professor at Georgetown University, and has a very long career in trade matters. She has served in the WTO appellate body and has recently co-written a book, China's Belt and Road Implications for the US. We also have with us Dr. Bruno Maçães, who has been minister in the Portuguese government, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, research assistant at the Wilfried Martens Institute at European Studies. And he has also written a lot of books about Eurasia, the Belt and Road, and recently geopolitics for the end time. And very warmly welcome, both of you. And for you in the audience, at the end of this conversation, we'll have the possibility to take a few questions and you can type them in the Q&A section. So today we will talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. It was something launched by President Xi Jinping in October 2013 at a conference in Kazakhstan, Astana. It is many things. It's an ambitious infrastructure project involving countries in Asia, Europe, Africa, also lately Latin America. It has been called the New Silk Road, making connotations to the history, of course, but replacing camels with ships and trains. And it aims to linking water and land-based transport, connecting the world in a new way. It's a community of shared destiny, as President Xi Jinping has described it. And it's also about consolidating China's political, economic, and commercial role on a global level. And soon after the president's announcement, the party officially endorsed the Silk Road Economic Belt and the Century Maritime Silk Road. And it was also later included in the Chinese Communist Party constitution. So it is an interconnected system of transport, energy, digital infrastructure, industrial clusters, free trade zones, logistics, energy, etc. Also a way to make China less vulnerable in case of possible US aggression or a naval blockade. Largely, it is financed by Chinese banks, state-owned companies. And in the last years, China, in the name of Belt and Road Initiative, have funded and built a vast array of roads, railways, ports, power plants, telecommunication, platforms, including in 139 countries. But it is also a foreign policy tool, so that China can shape its external environment rather than adapting to it. So the question is, what kind of animal is this? How shall we label it? Jennifer and Bruno, what is the BRAI? Is it infrastructure? Is it a foreign policy tool, connectivity project? Jennifer, starting with you, how would you describe this?
Well, I think part of it is fairly amorphous. And part of the reason we're all having such difficulties is that it is not transparent. It is not clear. There's not a central sort of organization within China that is dedicated to the Belt and Road. I mean, even the name itself, we say Belt and Road Initiative. Within China, they would refer to it as One Belt, One Road. So even the term is a little hard to get your hands on. In the end, for me, it is more a brand that tends to be put on all manner of projects. Obviously, one of the things that we've seen is the Belt and Road Initiative really morph. It started out very much as you described it, dedicated to ports, railroads, roads, hard infrastructure. It has clearly changed, and particularly COVID, I think, has pushed that change such that it has become heavily a digital exercise, very much more around telecommunications, financial technology, healthcare technology. So it has morphed into becoming a digital enterprise. Again, something different than what we saw before. So, and again, projects end up falling under the Belt and Road umbrella, if you will, when they're successful. And sometimes we've seen when they're not as successful, all of a sudden they kind of fall out of that moniker. So I think it's, again, moniker, brand is maybe a better way to think about it. And it is, again, gone well beyond its initial geographic limitations and its initial forays in terms of what does it cover.
Thank you very much. Bruno, you have called the BRA a Chinese plan to build a new world, replacing the US-led international system. Would you like to elaborate on that? And unmute.
Of the Belt and Road. So for me, it's as you said, it's a community of shared destiny. I think we in the West would call it a political order as a synonym for that. When I started writing about it, and 2 years after it was launched, it was very usual to see the Belt and Road described as a project to be concluded around 2049, at the 100th anniversary of People's Republic of China. So already there, you could see that it wasn't an initiative, an infrastructure initiative. An infrastructure initiative is not concluded over a period of decades. And in fact, around 2018, when I was living in China for a year, it became even more common to talk about the Belt and Road as a project to be concluded within 100 years. So really in the next century, and something for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren to be talking about. So I felt always very strongly, and in all my lectures, all my talks, I insist on this, it's not an infrastructure project. In fact, when President Xi Jinping presented in 2013, infrastructure of 5 pillars, it's fundamentally about trade, about industry, and about political influence, or policy coordination, as it was presented back in 2013. It's a very ambitious project, and I think it is important to stress that it is directly aimed at the United States and the American order. If you look at all the maps, and some of them are semi-official, there isn't an official map, but some are semi-official, published by Xinhua News Agency and so on. The United States doesn't appear. It's on the reverse of the map, and it has in a way become an isolated island. And I think that's fundamentally the Chinese idea. Not to replace the United States through a Pacific war or Pacific confrontation, but extending its influence over Eurasia and over Africa in such a way that the United States would become increasingly isolated. And I think we'll talk about this later with Jennifer as well, the extent to which this is a direct challenge to the United States and to Europe as well.
Yes, absolutely. We'll come back to that, and also the changing nature, as Jennifer alluded to, post-COVID. The financing of this is very much fundamentally financed by debt, and also project backed by the Chinese Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China. But it has led to enormous debt in some countries involved. I saw figures that the East African country Djibouti has a debt corresponding to 70% of the GDP to China. Montenegro has 83%. Sri Lanka couldn't pay for a harbor related to the BRI, and has rented it out for 99 years to China. And Tajikistan had to give away a piece of its territory as a sort of repayment of this. And there are also examples of some political favors that are expected on this. You wrote in your book, Bruno, that countries have only two choices: agreeing to the basic elements of the Belt and Road initiatives, or finding themselves on the wrong side of history. What do you mean by that? And how do you link the debt issue in this? Because these figures are, of course, in very poor countries, quite dramatic.
Well, it always struck me that Chinese authorities now have a whole philosophy of history. In fact, I'm here in a conference in Russia, and yesterday I heard some Chinese strategists, and their idea is that the US is in terminal decline and that the future belongs to China. And the Belt and Road absorbs some of this philosophy of history. The question of that, I think, is important. I think it's important to notice that this is not specific to the Belt and Road, the reliance on debts. We're now seeing with Evergrande in China how it is part of the Chinese growth model, which is also applied domestically. So it's not something that China has, in a Machiavellian way, invented for export. It's part of its growth model. But the problems we're seeing in China, we're also going to see it in many other countries who are highly indebted with projects that don't make a lot of economic sense. China will pay a price, but those countries will pay a price as well. On the one hand, I think this is a product of certain lack of experience. Western countries made this mistake as well after Second World War and for 2 or 3 decades, which then led to the Rome Club and Paris Club and so on. On the other hand, I think Chinese authorities are relatively relaxed with the question of that because it is not significant in the Chinese context. The amounts that we're talking about in China are dwarf the amounts of foreign investment by several orders of magnitude. And on the other hand, it offers interesting political opportunities. I think China witnessed over the years how the West was able to use the IMF and finance as a tool of geopolitical power. And China is interested in doing the same. So when Kenya, particularly now after COVID, is in difficulties servicing its debt, well, it's conversations that Kenyan authorities are going to have with Chinese authorities. And Chinese authorities see that an opportunity to use that leverage for other purposes, and some of them bluntly political. So in that sense, it is a trap, but not, I guess, in the Machiavellian sense where this was deliberately constructed as a tool for export.
Thank you. How do you see this, Jennifer? I think you write in your report as well that in a way it is a failure by the West that China has been able to step in globally like this. I mean, we are talking about more or less involvement of almost 140 countries of the world. So it's obviously filling a gap somewhere that Europe or the US or other actors were not able to fill. How do you see that?
Well, again, I do think that is exactly how it started. I mean, at the very beginning of this, well, in part, the Belt and Road started in some ways because China was trying to bring all of the development and everything that had happened on the sort of east coast of China into its internal provinces within the internal parts of China and then move it out from there. So it started in that way. But it's very clear that along the way that these projects are being financed is, in fact, creating tremendous amounts of macroeconomic instability and saddling a lot of countries that were already in a significant amount of debt with debt. And yet it's exactly as you and Bruno have said, a lot of them felt they had no choice. They need power. They need roads. They need railroads. And to some significant degree, the United States, Europe, the World Bank, and others had stepped away from these very big projects, very big infrastructure projects. In part, the World Bank and others had standards around environmental controls, around doing a lot of the sort of macroeconomic checks in advance. And other countries now, a lot of these developing countries that desperately need a power plant, they can go to China and they can get it with quickly, fast, and what they perceive to be cheaper. So the lure of engaging in this was very strong for these countries. But what we're now seeing, and again, this comes out in this report, and I would argue comes out even more clearly in a subsequent report that was written by one of my colleagues from Georgetown Law, Anna Gelpern, and some colleagues, looking at 100 loan contracts that they were able to get their hands on. And that's part of the issue, is most of this is very non-transparent. But when they were able to actually read the terms of 100 of these BRI contracts, what did they find? Every one of the contracts has huge secrecy clauses in it. Nobody is supposed to disclose anything about these loans. Well, again, that's not normally how you do development finance. Secondly, there is clauses in all of them that say you may not go to the Paris Club or any other place to seek help if you get into trouble in terms of renegotiating or rethinking that this kind of debt. They have unusual sort of cross default provisions. They have requirements in many instances that the countries have to have an offshore bank account, in essence, to backstop this loan so that it's very clear that these are loans, these are not grants, this is not concessional lending. These are straight up loans in which these countries are supposed to be paying back, significant amounts of money to China with sort of no recourse anywhere else if and when the loan sort of goes south, and that a huge amount of that debt is then collateralized by property, by access to, the port, or as you put it, again, land and other resources within those countries is the collateral behind these debts. So that if and when they go bad, there is this issue of when, where, and how China then gets control that it would not otherwise get in all of these countries around the world. So I think it should be clear. This is not, like normal development finance. This is quite unusual in that sense.
You talked about the lack of transparency, which of course an important issue, but there's also lack of other things that both of you have risen, and we discussed in the European Union as well. I mean, the lack of clauses on human rights, on basic labor rights in the construction work, environmental clauses, and so on. So, this is profitable loans, and they have a large advantage, but it comes with, no real demands like the US and Europe and other international organizations would put certain clauses and certain demands on this basic fundamental conventions, and that is of course also something that has led to reaction and triggered some criticism towards the whole BRI idea. Would you like to comment, Bruno?
Yeah, the lack of transparency is really quite extraordinary. Portugal signed a BRI memorandum with China, as you know. I haven't seen it. It hasn't been published unless it was in the last 2 weeks. And I have some contacts in Portugal, but I still haven't been able to see it. In Pakistan, I talk about in my book, there are 2 BRI plans. One of them is fully public. It's on the internet. It's 20 pages, and it's not very interesting, to say the least. The other one that I was able to access, apparently my sources are better in Pakistan than in Portugal. The other one is 120 pages long. It's not anywhere on the internet, and it's very interesting. And I discuss it in some detail in my book. Switzerland, I think, gave a very good example of how to do this. Switzerland also signed a memorandum, BRI memorandum, but the very evening it signed the memorandum, it published it on the internet. And so the Swiss people can see and can have some scrutiny and some public debate, which is happening in Switzerland. But it's certainly one point where we have to be very suspicious of what is happening. And also, let me add this, I've seen some news about how the Belt and Road is collapsing because investment levels are much lower. I would be very skeptical about that because we only know about investment levels with a lag of 3, 4, 5 years. Eventually, some of these investment deals and projects are made public in the recipient countries or perhaps in China, but not immediately, not for a period of years. So we actually don't know what the investment level in 2020 is or 2021, and we'll have to wait a few years. This was a real challenge writing the book. It's not the kind of book I had to travel a lot around the world, talk to people. It's not the kind of book you can research on the internet, which is troubling, obviously, as Jennifer pointed out.
Jennifer, did you want to come in?
I was only going to say, it's interesting because one of the things that we learned in doing this report and others have learned is, again, this issue of how difficult it is for countries because, again, they're told unequivocally they have to be very non-transparent about it. And yet what we find is that when the United States, for example, has been able to get in from at the very beginning and at least provide some technical assistance or advice to countries. For example, there was a port that was being built in Myanmar, and the United States was able to send in a team to provide some technical assistance. The original price tag for that was around $7.8 billion. At the end, the agreement was signed for 1.8. So again, there was this huge effort to try to say you're being overcharged. What China is providing is not what they should be doing. Be careful about this. And if and when you ever have the opportunity to do that, there is an ability, and again, this is what countries need to do, is to understand what their options may be and where and when they can push back. The other thing that I will say is one of the pushbacks that we are seeing in a number of the countries is on the labor issue that you mentioned. Most of the countries, the concern about doing one of these Belt and Road projects is there often is little to no skills transfer, because in general, the labor, particularly the management labor, the engineers, et cetera, tend to be Chinese nationals that are brought in to do the project. So a country may be left with a power plant or a road or something, but what they are not left with is highly developed skills among their own people to continue to run or operate or maintain or repair whatever the project is that was built by China. So this issue of skills transfer has become a serious issue where many countries are at least recognizing that that's among the things they're not getting with many of these Belt and Road projects.
Well, this is obviously a problem in the recipient countries, but your whole report and both of you have written about that. But Jennifer, your report on the implications for the United States also highlights a long list of problems that the Belt and Road Initiative has for the United States, and also not only for the countries, recipient countries, but also that the advantages outweighs the disadvantages outweighs the benefits for them, but also for the US. So that's the whole purpose of your report, and then to make some recommendations. We'll come back to some of them individually. But what are the main implications for the US on this?
Again, so what the report would say among the main implications for the United States is, again, what we've already talked about starting is the undermining of sort of global macroeconomic stability by increasing the likelihood of debt and, funding, economically questionable projects in heavily indebted countries, again, has a macroeconomic risk for the United States and for the rest of the world. But secondly, one of the things that is very concerning is that this Belt and Road Initiative has allowed Chinese companies to grow to among the largest companies in the world. And they've now then created a sort of subsidized entry into these other country markets in a way that excludes then competition from US companies, European companies, others, because now a number of these Chinese companies have, again, highly subsidized entry into these markets where you're not going to see a lot of competition. It's also allowed China to really gain footholds in the technology and the standard spaces. Again, you think about 5G and Huawei and all of these pushes with concerns about where Chinese telecommunications, but other technologies are headed. And you look at what China has been able to do as a result of dominating in a lot of the technology standards. And the way in which China dominates is either by just market share. If you own the entire 5G market in Africa, it doesn't leave much room for anyone else to come in. The other way that they're dominating in the technology side is by absolutely flooding the zone in terms of the number of technology standards that they are submitting to all of the international standard setting organizations, particularly the International Telecommunications Union that sets all of the standards across telecoms. Again, Huawei alone submitted 20,000 technical standards for 5G. United States, maximum total of less than, 10-fold less than that. So again, the standards are being written to favor Chinese telecommunications and other companies, and they're sort of taking over a lot of that. I would say the other concern, again, for the United States and for the rest of the world is it makes it harder for the World Bank, for the United States' Development Finance Corporation, and others to insist on environmental standards, labor standards, human rights standards, and other things. If countries can go to China and get quick and fast access to money and infrastructure development, why are they going to bother to go to the World Bank that may be perceived of as harder, as more difficult, as slower, and having all of these conditions? I would say concerning for the United States, and I would argue the rest of the world, is the degree to which this leaves, again, countries susceptible to Chinese political pressure. And we've seen it. Don't say anything about what's going on in Hong Kong. Don't raise any issues about forced labor in Xinjiang. Don't comment on what's going on in Taiwan. Stay out of these issues is the pressure that's being put by, China on its BRI recipient countries. And so, again, that is definitely one of those huge concerns for the United States. And I would say the last one is the effect that it's going to have on the ability to fight climate change. I mean, among the other things that this Belt and Road Initiative has financed is 260 coal-fired power plants being built in all of these BRI countries, most of which have a lifespan of 35 years or more. So again, we are locking a lot of these countries into a carbon-intensive future that will make it harder for everyone around the world to really get serious about climate change. So, I mean, those are among the kind of key things that were raised in terms of concerns. And again, I would argue they're concerns clearly for the United States, but for the rest of the world as well.
Would you agree with that, Bruno? I mean, in the beginning, 2015, we had the European Union Connectivity Platform, and that seemed initially to be in line with the BRI initiatives, and there were lots of cooperation, and some countries signed up, and there was this 16+1 initiative, also including countries from the Balkan countries cooperating with this, deepening their cooperation in a vast variety of fields, also including investment and education and so on. But this has gradually divided Europe in a way as well, and has led to political pressure in some countries. We have seen that, and as Jennifer alluded to, the refusal for some EU countries to vote in favor of human rights condemnation in the United States, and so there is a political pressure as well. How do you see this, the effects on Europe?
Well, the change in Europe has been dizzying fast since the years we were sitting in the Trade Council around, both of us, around 12, 13. I remember during the Eurozone crisis, Portugal and Greece were actually being pressured to accept Chinese investment. Now I think the country would be pressured not to accept Chinese investment. So there's been a change, and that's good. We've evolved with the times. I think we were too slow at first. Now, I think the relationship is increasingly imbalanced. China now has a lot of influence in Europe. We see how it dominates the news. We've seen how a Secretary of Defense in the United Kingdom had to resign on a case involving China. And this seems to happen more and more, that China is daily present in our politics. And we've lost influence in China. So the challenge now is to try to rebalance the relationship. And some of the initiatives the Commission took, you were still there when some of these initiatives were adopted, seemed to me very promising and very good, very coherent. There's clearly now a very coherent strategy of going element by element and try to build a new puzzle that is much more balanced on procurement, on trade defense instruments, and in other areas as well. So that's the challenge, I think, for Europe now. We are clearly not interested in cutting economic links with China. We're interested, in a way, in refounding the relationship, because China is no longer a developing country. We feel in Europe we've been too naive about some of these things, and we want to refound the relationship on better grounds. I would sum the challenge in that way for the next few years.
Thank you. You both alluded also to the environmental consequences. We were only a couple of weeks from the Glasgow COP26. And of course, China is the biggest polluter in the world, but it is also a country who has a lot of very innovative green technology. And it has started to address some of the criticism, signing up to the G20 guidelines on sustainable financing. And I heard the president promising a couple of days ago, maybe weeks ago, that China would stop financing coal plants within the project of BRA. But at the same time, there is a lot of environmental issues related to the different projects in the different countries as well. So how is this compatible with the Paris goals? Can it be changed? Is the sort of greening of BRI, is it real? Can it be progressed in that way? How do you see that? Who wants?
I can start, I guess, a little bit. I mean, to me, this is one where Xi Jinping is saying a lot of the right things. I mean, and there's no question that there was major meetings held, and one of the major BRI forums was really dedicated to this idea of greening the Belt and Road. And they've put together, again, a very good green coalition. They've started, again, adopting and promoting a number of BRI green related lending principles so that there would be more green finance. So there's been a lot of good things said, and the question really comes is whether there's going to be any enforcement or any follow through on what has been said. Again, and a lot of this has been fairly recent, as you said. I mean, Xi Jinping announced that China would stop building coal-fired power plants outside of the borders of China. But that pledge raises a whole lot of issues. Is it just the building of the plants, or are they going to stop financing them? That was a little less clear. And again, it is one thing to say we're going to stop doing it outside of China. What about within China? Because obviously that is where there is a tremendous number of coal-fired plants, and there's more in the pipeline to be built within China. So some of these pledges, and particularly, again, a move. The major problem to me on the environmental side with the Belt and Road Initiative is the presumption was that the project was green as long as it met the environmental standards of the country in which the project was being built. Even if that country had low or no environmental standards, as long as it met the domestic environmental standard requirements of that country, it was deemed a green project. And that's what's really got to change. We've got to say, no, that is not good enough. You have to be consistent with international standards on what constitutes a green financed project, what constitutes green, what, et cetera, has got to be done under more international principles. They're out there. And the question is China going to actually move in a genuinely green direction or not?
What do you think, Bruno?
Well, it seems to me that China is interested in having an ambitious climate policy, but often that's not for environmental purposes, it's for geopolitical purposes. China is very aware that whoever controls the energy technologies of the future is going to control the future. So there's a genuine, I believe, not rhetorical, there's been a change over the past 20, 30 years in China. And there's a genuine interest, national interest in turning towards new energy paradigms. But that, because it is geopolitical, because it is not driven by environmental concerns, it's perfectly compatible where they are marginally profitable to continue to have coal-fired plants and other polluting energy sources. The PRI, in fact, was from the start an attempt to delocalize some of these highly polluting industries to other countries, both because they are no longer profitable in China, salaries have risen, but also because there were concerns about pollution in China. And so there's been a lot of delocalization to particularly Indonesia, where some steel plants have been built with Chinese financing. Now, this is a concern, but obviously Western democracies need to have an alternative as well. They need also to invest in some of these countries. Let me say, we have been very critical of the BRI during this discussion. Let me add just a note about how in many cases there simply is no alternative. I travel a lot in these countries, and what you hear over and over again is that the West is not present. And I saw that. We go to Djibouti, it's full of Chinese businessmen occupying all the available hotel rooms. There isn't a single European or American businessman in Djibouti. There are some military, but that's all. We saw the other day, just a few weeks ago, a Indonesian minister say, we open up our investment possibilities to the whole world. Only the Chinese can. So that's obviously something that has to be responded to. I think you want to discuss that also later in this discussion, but we haven't really been able to provide an alternative to many of these countries.
Let's go into that a little bit, because obviously there is a failure of the US, Europe, or the Western world to provide the possibilities of investment and to assist developing countries who, as you both said, are in desperate need of some of these, both physical infrastructure, but also digital infrastructure, and where China has been quick to engage. And in your report to Jennifer, you outline a long list of what the US should do to address the Belt and Road Initiative, and that the US needs a coherent strategy, both when it comes to US national interest in a variety of fields, but also from the sort of multilateral viewpoint, what should be done. Has that work? I mean, it was some time that you released this report. Was it eight months or so? Has that work begun? What is happening?
Yeah, I would say actually, it's interesting to work on these kind of things and then figure out whether anything you ever write is actually ever read and absorbed by others. And on this one, I would say absolutely yes. I think we have been really, really pleased at how much the Biden administration has taken on board a number of the recommendations. And I would say in two or three areas are the ones that there has been the greatest uptake, if you will, of a number of these. I mean, to break it down, I mean, what we really recommended is that the United States has to do an awful lot to mitigate the economic risks of the Belt and Road Initiative. And that really focuses on addressing the emerging debt crisis, on insisting on more transparency around lending, on sort of educating foreign governments about the alternatives that could or should be available to them. And that's where we've seen a big uptake, where there is an understanding in the United States that we need to put all of those that are involved together with our embassies and with our allies and partners, including the European Union, to make sure that countries know that here's the pros of working with China on these Belt and Road projects. Here's the cons. Here is an alternative that could be available to you. And so the question is, again, getting in that door early. And so, yes, I think there is a real increased awareness in the United States, particularly in our Development Finance Corporation and some of the others that are involved in sort of development lending. I think there's been a lot more interest at the World Bank. So in that sense, yes. The second one where I think there's been a huge ability of the Biden administration to really take up these recommendations has been on the issue of improving U.S. competitiveness. Because again, an awful lot of what this report is saying is part of the reason that the United States has not been as directly able to offer something is like take 5G as an example. We don't have 5G. I mean, we have to look at Nokia and at Samsung and at Ericsson and at others. So the issue is then how do we become more competitive in other technologies, and or how do we provide a consortium where the European companies may provide the hard tech, but we could provide a lot of the services and technology that go along with telecommunications. So it is a lot of improving our technology, improving our competitiveness. So there, I think you've seen in the bill that even the United States Senate has already passed a huge emphasis on improving the United States' investment in R&D spending, investment in next generation technology. Again, some issues around how do we sort of provide both our Development Finance Corporation and our Exim Bank with appropriate funding to support public-private partnerships. So again, a huge amount of the emphasis there on working on public-private partnerships. And then the last one that I think there has been a real uptake in at least concern about and thinking about is the security risks that are presented by the Belt and Road Initiative. And again, where I think there has been a lot of looking is on the issue of what's going on in the ports. Because again, under the Belt and Road Initiative, China, again, has both built and now owns and operates many, many ports in many strategic locations around the world. And the uptake of our report is that you should not assume that that means that every one of those ports can then become a naval base for China to operate on. That is not what we're suggesting. But the big security risk in those ports is because so much data is moved on underseas cables. Where do those cables come up out of the water? They come up out of the water at ports. Many of those ports, again, owned and controlled by China. And so the issue is, again, to create greater security around those undersea cable networks. And again, I think there has been a lot of interest among the United States and its allies to make sure that those undersea cables are secure. A big effort in terms of how we think about cybersecurity in and around there. So yes, some of these recommendations are being taken up. A lot of them are incorporated within that Build Back Better World sort of program that was announced as part of the G7 and the US-EU summits that have occurred. Part of it is the domestic legislation on Build Back Better. But again, I think the bipartisan support in the Congress to do a lot of that is because there is a bipartisan recognition that we've got to get serious about how to respond to China.
Yes, you referred to the Build Back Better initiative that was taken by G7 leaders in Cornwall earlier this summer. And they talked about a huge amount of money needed in order to do that. I think they talked about $40 trillion until 2035 to assist developing countries and to sort of step in as an alternative to do that. That's a huge amount of money. And the European Union has also announced via the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, in her speech of the State of the Union last September, just a couple of weeks ago, that they wanted to have a new connectivity strategy called the Global Gateway to build partnership in infrastructure based on values, transparency, good governance. She didn't mention China, but it was all over the speech. And that, of course, links in both to what the US have been saying, what the G7 is doing, and then again, what the EU has been doing in the past. How do you see that? Is that some sort of alternative, Bruno?
Well, I haven't been impressed, I have to say. It seems that every year there's a new initiative. I remember a Blue Dot initiative. Now there's a Build Back Better World. It's an ungrammatical name for the initiatives. In the US is trying to imitate China that always has these ungrammatical sentences in English. Let me add, before I turn to Europe, let me add a little criticism of the US here. I think the US is too focused on security issues and neglecting economic issues, which may turn out to be more important. I think the AUKUS example, just at the same time that the US was announcing and working on AUKUS, China was working on joining the CPTP. I think that's the acronym, Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that provided a good contrast. China is clearly focused on economic expansion, clearly focused on trying to dominate some of the global supply chain and the value chains, and the US is clearly neglecting this aspect for whatever reason. I think Europe is better in this respect. It's more focused on economic issues. What I would say is, again, I pointed out at the beginning, I don't think this is fundamentally about infrastructure. This is fundamentally about trade, industry, and technology. And so let's try to focus on that. Infrastructure is only part of it. Let's try, for example, to work on our free trade agreement with Latin America, with the Mercosur agreement with the EU. This is an area where China has been very slow. Let's try to be first. But as you know very well, Cecilia, this has turned out to be quite difficult. Why did Xi Jinping come up with this idea of the Belt and Road Initiative? Fundamentally, as a way to put pressure on all the officials and all the intellectuals and all the decision makers in China to force them to be more outward looking. Because he is well aware that the temptation, particularly in our time, is to focus on your domestic issues. And we need something of this sort, not a small initiative announced on the margins of some conference. We need a big, dynamic debate about the need to be more outward looking. And if you want to give that a label, we can give that a label, but global Britain, global EU, this is what we need. And this is the response to the Belt and Road, not a very specific infrastructure initiative, which is not a sufficient response.
And will we get there?
There's been some progress. I think this commission has stressed this idea of a geopolitical commission, and I'm also, either worried or hopeful that as we realize how much influence and power we're losing, that there will be a stronger response. But I've become convinced that it's only through a kind of a Sputnik moment of sorts where we realize that we've fallen behind, that there will be a shakeup and some response, that we have first to step out of the routine politics that we seem to have sunk into.
And how do you see the future of this? You alluded, Bruno, that there are reports saying that China can't afford this, and you're quite skeptical to some of this, but obviously the pandemic has influenced the whole project. I mean, the workers and engineers have not been able to move, so some projects have been slowed down for obvious reasons. Some have turned out to be very expensive, too expensive or not, I cannot judge. And there's also signals that the BRI is sort of being recalibrated for a post-COVID world, focusing much more on technology, telecom, connectivity, healthcare, financial services, rather than hardcore infrastructure. And you said many times that is not an infrastructure project, even if that's an element of it. So what is, and at the same time, we have seen a growing skepticism also in the developing world vis-a-vis China. There's a lot of political, diplomatic crisis that has been going on as well. Will this affect the project? How do you see the future of the Belt and Road? Jennifer?
I think I'm less skeptical.
Doesn't matter.
I'm less skeptical than some of the commentators. There seem to me to be two levels. At the level of public discourse, diplomacy, soft power, China is clearly lost in the last 2 years. Public opinion surveys show that. But at a more structural level of economic, industrial, technological forces, that doesn't seem to be the case. Chinese exports are booming, including to the United States. Would you believe that Chinese exports are today to the US are today 31% higher than at the beginning of 2019? I'm not comparing to the pandemic here, I'm comparing to 2019. 31% higher. No one would believe this. And clearly China came out of the pandemic with an even more dominant position in global value chains, which is extraordinary because I remember in January, February 2020, everyone announced that this was the end of China's dominant position. But they came out of it in a more dominant position, and now, of course, trying to solidify that with some important trade agreements that they are signing to do with the EU. That was attempted, not so successfully, in part because the diplomatic level interfered and the political level interfered. But I suspect in Asia, they will be more successful with this. And we just heard that Singapore, for example, seems to be supportive of China's bid to join the CPTPP.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer?
Yeah, I mean, clearly one of the things that we also highlighted is the concern that you mentioned it. Part of this is that the United States has stepped away. And clearly where the United States has stepped away is from trade agreements within Asia. I mean, the whole idea behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership from the very beginning was for the United States to be planting that flag that we're interested, we're engaged, we're involved in the countries in the Pacific. And yet, you know, again, the first thing among the first days in office, the Trump administration withdrew from that TPP. And I think, to be honest, I think the United States was a little bit surprised that Japan was willing to step up and bring about the CPTPP without the United States in it. I think there was some assumption that without the United States it would fold. It did not. And if you then look at what happened next, you had then the creation, you know, again, heavily promoted by China of the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership. So again, that brings together, if you think about it, you know, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and all of the ASEAN countries. And yes, it's not a full-on free trade agreement. It's not as deep as the CPTPP. But what it is doing is clearly making sure that China remains at the center of the hub of all of the trade in and around there. And that RCEP agreement, whatever else is in it, you know, it has these common rules of origin that say that if any of the components, any part of the supply chain is located within one of those RCEP countries, then it qualifies for the treatment under RCEP. Well, that is a huge push to have the entirety of your supply chain within that RCEP region. So to the extent that Asia was already a very consolidating regional economy, if you will, I mean, that everything was centralizing, it's only more so. And what that means is it only gets to be harder and harder for everyone to compete with China. If you just look again at what did China create as a result of this Belt and Road Initiative, you know, the single largest operator of electricity grids is China's state grid. You go down the list of the global Fortune 100 companies, and it is one Chinese company after another that has been able to grow, again, behind somewhat protected walls within China, you know, bring in technology from the West, whether by theft or by agreement or by forced transfer, then grow those technology-based companies within a somewhat protected Chinese market. And once you perfect them and get them to be these very large, very competitive companies, then you take them out into the world under the Belt and Road Initiative or others. But that is clearly the model that China is following. I would agree with Bruno. This is not going to stop. I mean, these companies are now among the most successful, competitive, you know, large, dominant in technologies, in wind, in solar, in, you know, telecommunications, in financial technology, in electronic payments. You know, again, the Chinese own that market, you know, and again, you add in all of the other things that came about as a result, their own blockchain network in order to engage in, again, a lot of this kind of technology, the ability to download all of this information from all of these smart cities and smart grids all over the world means that they have more data to create more artificial intelligence than any of the rest of it. So it becomes, again, this issue of how and when does the rest of the world then understand how difficult it will be to compete with China if we are not engaged in that Asian market. And again, this is where the United States is just way, way behind. But we are not in any of these major architectural agreements within the Asian markets.
obviously. I mean, China has been very, very intelligently pushing in all these markets, and Europe and US have not sufficiently engaged, have not been sufficiently active or aware or focusing on other things. So lots of catching up to do, apparently. There are lots of questions coming in. So can I give you 2-3 questions and we'll group them and then we'll see how much time we have. There's one question asking if the Belt and Road Initiative making aggressive steps towards making the yuan, the Chinese currency, an international currency for trade and financing. That's a question from Vinit Sharma. And then we have a question, if you know of any specific examples when an African country actually defaulted on their debt to China and China ended up seizing the project as collateral, taking control. I think I mentioned a few there, but if you want to comment on this. This is by Rachel Miller. And then John von Herf is asking whether the US or the EU is really the best messenger to convince third countries that a Chinese offer under the Belt and Road has political strings, given the track record through the World Bank action in the wake of the Asian financing and the prescription as imposing a Washington consensus. Well, that's a political question you might want to deal or not with. So these are 3 questions. If you want to we'll come back with a few others later. Do you want to start, Bruno?
Yeah, well, I agree with the last listener. I think China, in some respects, is trying to imitate those tool of powers that Western democracies have used, the IMF in particular. And so I don't think it will work particularly well to say that, well, this can be used by China to exert influence, because these countries in Africa and Asia know very well that that's happened in the past as well. We have to offer a better alternative. That's the only way to respond to the Belt and Road, not through this sometimes moralized criticism of the Belt and Road. In my experience, talking to officials in some of these recipient countries, there was certainly, that's met with cynicism, to put it mildly. Then the question about yuan, I think China is working on it, but without any kind, without rushing it. China knows that it would have to pay a high price if it really wants yuan to be an international reserve currency. It would have to open its capital account, perhaps becoming vulnerable to capital flight. So they're working at it slowly, trying to rebalance. They would encourage the euro, for example, to play a larger role, and they've been buying more euros for their own reserves. But without moving too fast on this, I've never seen any kind of urgency from Chinese authorities to operate a kind of revolution in the global monetary system.
Jennifer?
Well, I would only agree with all of those comments. And the only thing that sort of was interesting, and again, not entirely BRI related, but to some degree on the currency issue, is obviously China has sped ahead with the development of a digital currency. So you're now seeing, a fairly fast development of a digital renminbi. And the second thing, again, that China has done, and again, you have to remember that digital currency is then going to be accounted for, if you will, or ledgered, through a blockchain network. In that sense, like other cryptocurrencies, and yet it is not like other cryptocurrencies in the sense that the central bank in China will have then eyes on all of the transactions that are done, and real-time eyes on all of the transactions that are done in this digital currency. But again, China has also developed its own blockchain network. So in that sense, you're not necessarily seeing, I don't think, I would agree, not this immediate move to have the yuan be this international currency, but the degree to which the renminbi is going to become dominant as a digital currency, in other words, more and more and more transactions, by sheer market share, you're going to start to see many, many more transactions being done in renminbi, particularly as China owns the digital financial payments system. I mean, through PayPal, through WeChat Pay and Alipay. The number of consumers that are using those, again, renminbi-based, Chinese-based apps for all kinds of financial transactions. I mean, more than 1.5 billion people are on those pay forms that are, again, in that Chinese currency, and then increasingly are going to be ledgered via a Chinese owned and controlled blockchain network. You will see more dominance, not through the normal routes of currency, but again, through just the sheer volume of transactions outside of China. And that's the point for me, is that a lot of these customers using that WeChat and that Alipay are not necessarily in China. They may be Chinese nationals that are living elsewhere in the world, but you are starting to see that expansion of the use of that currency. Are the US and the EU the best messengers with respect to a lot of the other countries? Clearly not. And that is the real concern of how you diplomatically, delicately say, here are at least some things that you should consider as you're looking at doing a project. And for me, the biggest way in which the United States and the European Union can best respond is to have a good alternative to offer, a realistic, both from a cost standpoint, from a timing standpoint, from a technology standpoint, from a quality standpoint, from a skills transfer to labor standpoint, have good alternatives to offer. That to me is going to send a much bigger message than simply trying to say, watch out for BRI. I think that message will not be well received. But if we can start consistently putting together, and again, we're not going to be able to match China dollar for dollar. That will not happen. So the issue is for the United States and for the European Union to be very strategic. Where is it important to have an American or a European flag, if you will, planted in a particular technology or in a particular geographic place? Where is that strategically important? And make sure that in those locations for those technologies, we are offering a very good alternative to China. And that's what hasn't really happened yet, is to do that kind of real thinking about from a strategic standpoint, where is it important for the United States and the European Union and others to have an alternative to BRI readily available, and that countries see it in that way. And I think that is what we most of all need to do as part of, again, I would agree with this terribly named Build Back Better World, Global Europe, whatever we're going to call it. But that's to me what the work of that consortium really needs to be in it. And we need to get there really quickly. In terms of the specific seizures, I don't want to try to come up with one, because again, a lot of all I'll say in terms of China seizing property is, in general, what we've seen is when these loans get into trouble, what China does not tend to do is to write off the debt or to try to foreclose. What China tries to do most of all is to simply extend out the terms of the loan. So the vast majority of the loans that have been troubled have simply been extended out. Those loans are still there. The collateral has not necessarily been seized. The presumption is to just give countries a longer amount of time, but obviously with interest not being reduced. So again, the debts are just piling up, but that has been the dominant way in which China has approached loans that are headed towards what would otherwise be foreclosure.
Yeah. I think we have time for a few quick questions as well. There's one about the vaccine diplomacy of China. Does it supplement the BRI activities? And then one referring to the recent speech by USTR Ambassador Tai, who mentioned the term recoupling between the US and China. Is it possible, and I will end on a more positive tone maybe, that in the future, under an improved atmosphere, that US and China could cooperate and compete in BRI and other infrastructural and digital economy? If yes, in what area may there be cooperation? And how about the EU? Bruno, would you like to start with that one? Or those two, sorry. It's also about the vaccine.
There won't be any cooperation on common projects. The most we can hope for is for the confrontational rhetoric and language to be toned down, which I think it has been under Biden, perhaps a bit surprisingly. And USTR Tai has made these statements, which I'm still not entirely sure how to interpret them. First of all, this idea of recoupling was first introduced by a Chinese author, if you Google it, in a foreign affairs article. So it's interesting that it was picked up by the USTR. And what does it mean? I think it means that something similar to what I advocated as Europe's strategy a little earlier, that we shouldn't cut economic links, but we have to redesign them and rebalance them, in a way, rebuild them. That's how I interpret recoupling, not to couple again, but to couple in a different way. And she clearly wants to remove some strategic areas from a form of coupling that she thinks is too close, and limit close economic links to areas that are not strategic. And that makes sense to me. But by the way, and perhaps this is my last word, that sounds a lot like Europe's strategy. So I'm glad to see that the US, which criticizes it so often, is now adopting even some of our language. Live with that provocation.
Thank you, Bruno. I know you need to rush off to another conference, so you will discreetly zoom out. Thank you so much for being with us. Jennifer, do you still have 2 minutes to
I'll
address
try
those two
on the vaccines. It's interesting. As of September, China had delivered 1.1 billion vaccine doses to more than 100 countries. So it's very clear that China does, see itself as using vaccine diplomacy as, again, part of their outreach. And the vast proportion of those vaccine deliveries were to BRI recipients. However, again, the effectiveness of some of the Chinese shots has created somewhat of a pushback. If the vaccines are not really effective, again, that is creating some of a pushback. And from the very beginning, there was some concerns over it because China tended to do its testing on some of its vaccines among its BRI countries, because the testing came about at a time in which the number of cases in China was low enough that they were felt that they needed to go elsewhere to do some of the testing. And that, again, created in some of the countries a bit of a resentment of we're being used as guinea pigs for Chinese, pharmaceutical companies, and don't really appreciate that. So again, a bit of a mixed bag, but I will say, again, China, to its credit, in June really put together, 28 countries to launch an initiative for vaccine cooperation in Asia, and created this Asia and Pacific high-level conference on Belt and Road cooperation around vaccines. So within that Asian community, again, China is the one that is perceived to be stepping up and coordinating, again, the distribution and work in the vaccine space. And I would say getting well recognized among many in Asia for those efforts. But
also failure of us not to be able to deliver those vaccines.
There is no question. Again, for me, you have to step back from the very beginning. Why was the Belt and Road Initiative so successful in moving into all of these places? Because there was a vacuum. And it was a vacuum in infrastructure, it was a vacuum in telecommunications technology, and a vacuum in healthcare and vaccines that the United States and Europe left behind. And so China has appropriately, to some degree, filled that vacuum. That's a lot of where the BRI started and where it remains. And now I'm forgetting the second question that was in here. I apologize.
Was a question on the possibility of in the future recoupling.
So on Catherine Tai's speech. Yeah.
Yes.
So again, I think it was very interesting to me to have listened to Catherine Tai's speech. And I think from an American perspective, what you heard was largely basically stay the course, stay where we are, all of the tariffs, all of the phase 1 deal, everything that was done under the Trump administration, leave that in place, with two kind of additions. One is we're going to also focus very heavily on subsidies and state-owned enterprises, which is one of the things that the Trump administration did not touch. And secondly, we're going to try to figure out more how to do this with allies and partners, that we are going to abandon a little bit of that go it alone strategy. And again, what's not clear to me is how exactly the Biden administration is going to do those two sort of additional bells and whistles. What was interesting to me is then when I heard how that speech, so again, in the United States, the reaction to the speech was not very much change, stay the course. Whereas when I heard how it was received in Asia, it was quite different. And so that may be that Catherine Tai is really speaking to an Asian audience, which heard a lot of things that they wanted to hear, which is to some degree heard in that speech an acknowledgement that the United States has heavily been involved in breaking the U.S.-China relationship, that the United States was prepared to be the one to open the door, to begin conversations about how do we get it back together again, was using words like durable coexistence, something that I think was very much what those in Asia wanted to hear, and use this term recouple. So again, I don't know to the degree to which this was pitched at, sort of trying to, again, lower down the tone, lower down the rhetoric, and at least create an atmosphere, an environment in which there could be better U.S.-China both cooperation and discussions over a lot of the serious issues. So yes, we are not going to cooperate on all of these issues. We are at fundamentally different places on many, particularly of the trade issues between the US and China. So it will not all of a sudden be able to resolve these very long-standing differences. But the tone and the atmospherics, I think, are far better than they were a year ago.
I agree with that. And that's always the first step. Thank you so much, Jennifer, and also to Bruno, who had to rush away. Thank you for helping us understand the complexity and the difficulties and the challenges on the Belt and Road Initiative. It's been very enlightening. I've learned a lot. Thank you, all of you who were listening. Sorry not to be able to take all the questions. We will see you again in a month. There will be a discussion at that time on the outcome of the COP26 in Glasgow and of the greening of trade, if there is any result, or if not, where do we go from there? So welcome to tune in at that occasion. Thank you again, Jennifer. Thank you, Bruno.
Thank you.
And have a nice day, evening, afternoon, wherever you are.
Thank you.